Good afternoon. I'm Frank Gaffney. I'm the president of the Center for Security Policy and very pleased to be hosting this event, which will be partly I guess a book launch and partly an opportunity to celebrate its author and to talk about some of the really important issues that it raises. The book is entitled Team Jihad: How Sharia Supremacists Collaborate with Leftists to Destroy the United States. Its author is Matthew Vadum. He is the senior vice president at a most important organization here in Washington, D.C., the Capital Research Center, the author of numerous papers, analyses, articles, monographs, and books, including Subversion, Inc., How Obama's Acorn Red Shirts Are Still Terrorizing and Ripping Off American Taxpayers. He has, I think, performed brilliantly in pulling together this book about the degree to which folks like Acorn and a great many others on the left are actively collaborating with enemies of this country. I think they're best described as Sharia supremacists. Others call them Islamists, fundamentalist Muslims, what have you. Whatever you call them, they are folks who are not necessarily representative of all Muslims by any means, but nonetheless seek in what they consider to be their God-directed duty to achieve the triumph of this doctrine of Sharia over the entire world, including this country, and are perfectly prepared to make common cause with people who, as Matt says, don't have a whole lot of other things in common with them, other than apparently a desire to destroy this country to that end. So we're looking forward to having him introduce and describe some of the major findings of his book and some of the lessons to take away from it. And we will be joined in a discussion thereof by Gregory Angelo, the president of Log Cabin Republicans. He has a distinguished record of service in a variety of different organizations that have all in common, I think, trying to assure the freedoms that we hold dear in this country and that are unfortunately particularly at threat from those like Sharia supremacists as they exhibit an unmistakable hostility to and, in fact, violent aggression towards people in the LGBTQ community. And he will talk a bit about what he has confronted in trying to challenge such groups on both the left and in the Islamist community. It will be a very, I think, thought-provoking and perhaps otherwise provocative conversation, and I very much look forward to having first Matt Vadum and then Gregory Angelo contribute to it, and then we'll perhaps take some questions from those of you in the room and perhaps also from those of you commenting on the internet. With that, let's get underway. Matt Vadum, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Frank. Good to be here. I just want to open with the introductory quotation, the epigram in the book, and that is, "Only a coalition of Marxists and Islamists can destroy the United States." And that was said by Carlos the Jackal, Ilyich Ramirez Sanchez, a notorious terrorist who's now serving, I believe, several life imprisonment terms in Europe. The left and Islam have been working together for quite a long time to bring down the United States. Now, this alliance between the Islamic totalitarians and the left may seem counterintuitive to a lot of people, but they actually have a lot in common. And Team Jihad, the new short book that we're putting out today, delves into this relationship and why it's actually a natural fit. They both Islam and people on the radical fringes of the left both have an authoritarian, even totalitarian mindset. And as one world leader who considered himself to be a faithful Muslim and a socialist, he said that that Islam can take care of the spiritual realm, but the secular realm is appropriate for Karl Marx and socialism. And so there isn't really a contradiction between the two, although a lot of people in America, especially liberals and progressives, like to associate Islam with the right. I don't think it's really a valid comparison. I don't think the left-right political spectrum really applies to Islam very well. Just my personal opinion, not necessarily CSP's or anybody else's here. The key principle here is that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and that is why the left works with Islam to weaken America's free institutions, to make it more Sharia compliant. In other words, to make us afraid to do things that might offend Muslims. They would, in some cases, they'd like to, and in some countries have taken steps to make it more difficult to criticize Islam, or they've actually banned it. Canada, if it hasn't enacted it, is on the verge of enacting a law that will make it essentially blasphemous. They don't call it that, but it would be hate speech to criticize Islam there. And there are other efforts afoot in other countries, and people need to know what's really going on in order to fight back properly. The main weapon that the left and the Islamic activists use in the United States, in any event, is something they call Islamophobia, which one person has called a thought-terminating cliche. It's like calling somebody a racist. And in fact, if you are skeptical of Islam, you don't have to be, I'm not telling people they have to be opposed to Islam, but we have to understand its true nature. And if you are even questioning it, if you're not towing the politically correct line about Islam, you are deemed Islamophobic. And they will call you racist even though Islam isn't a race, because calling people racist in America is a very successful way of shutting them down. And they're often not very responsive to rational arguments once they start calling you names in any event. But the idea behind Islamophobia, which is promoted by CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations, and other groups like the rotten, corrupt Southern Poverty Law Center, which has $1/3 billion in assets and offshore investments in the Caribbean. They label people as basically thought criminals. They don't call them that. They call them people who are engaged in hate, that they're guilty of hate speech and hateful actions and so on, just for having an opinion. These are the same kinds of people who attacked Juan Williams, the Fox News pundit, who when he was at NPR said, he just described an emotion that he had, a fleeting emotion. He sat down on his seat in a commercial airliner. He saw people around him in what he described as Muslim garb, and he said a chill went up his spine. He felt nervous. He didn't act upon it. He didn't do anything. He didn't say anything. He just thought, well, I'm in an airplane. I know what happened September 11th, 2001, and it made me a little uncomfortable. And just for confessing this emotion that he had, that he didn't act upon, he was treated as a pariah, and he was forced out of NPR, and then Fox picked him up. So this weapon of Islamophobia, so-called Islamophobia, I don't acknowledge that it's a valid concept. I mention it, I'm putting scare quotes around it to be skeptical of it every time I say it, at least in my head. It is something that these people push. The Southern Poverty Law Center is one of the most egregious offenders in this respect. It's a far left, it calls itself a civil rights law firm, a public interest law firm, and this is, it doesn't actually spend a lot of time in court. It mostly puts together hate propaganda against conservatives and even moderate people who are skeptical of Islam. And it publishes there's something called the Intelligence Report, which is largely just propaganda. It labeled this organization, Center for Security Policy, a hate group, which is crazy because this is all we're just talking about public policy here. This is not a religion. I can't speak for CSP. Frank here does that. But this is not a hate organization. This is looking at national security issues and public policy. But they wish to shut down a real debate. They don't want it to happen. They want everybody to fall in line and agree with each other. And so they promote this angle. They had relations up until a couple of years ago with the FBI and DHS, and they may still be advising some aspects of the federal government on how to deal with national security issues so as not to offend Muslims. So that's the political reality. That's what's happening right now. Just some historical footnotes. Muhammad himself, that's the Islamic prophet Muhammad, there's no such thing as socialism, at least as a concept, when he was alive in the 600s, 600 years after the birth of Christ, or so. But he was open to redistribution of wealth. A lot of people don't know that, and I didn't know this until I did my research, that when he conquered Medina as part of his quest, he imposed a welfare state. He thought it was a good idea, and he had friends around him who counseled that and who were critical of people because they were rich. This idea has been embraced by Muslim thinkers throughout time, throughout Islam's 1,400 or so years in existence. The Islamic activists also like to reach out here in America to true believers and useful idiots. For example, when then Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad visited New York to give a speech at the United Nations a few years ago, and I think he did this on several occasions, he would have meetings with local progressives who would write about, and we have a record of these, fortunately, because they would write columns in left-wing publications like Alternet. And so we know that he met with them, and they were discussing situations and how to deal with the American government, and what could be done to stop what they were describing as the horrible embargoes, sanctions against the mullahs of Tehran. And so American groups were very active, like Ramsey Clark's group. He's a former attorney general from many decades ago who is now on the extreme left. So far left he marginalizes himself. But so the left has been reaching out to Islam, and Islam has been reaching out to the left. And another example of how they are embedded in the political infrastructure in our country is that you have that's the writer, Keith Ellison, Congressman Keith Ellison, the first Muslim member of Congress, who is a co-chairman of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which is the real conscience of the Democratic Party in Congress. These are the far left, the most left-wing members in Congress, and they, they coordinate, and they, it's not that they necessarily would need to sit there and have a chat. They agree on so many things. They just naturally are all moving in the same direction. So they have a lot of power, and they can cause hearings to happen, and they can have bills introduced. There was just a case a few weeks ago of the IT workers in the House of Representatives who were, I don't think they were arrested, but I think they, one of the brothers is wanted, or as a person of interest at least, for questioning by the FBI, and they may have been spying on behalf of a hostile organization, a hostile Muslim terrorist organization. You know, they got people in to meet President Bush after 9/11. You know, convinced President Bush, of all people, to say, you know, Islam is a religion of peace, which it clearly is not, and this sort of propaganda is repeated daily in the halls of Congress, among Democrats and Republicans alike. So the left and Islam have combined to present an image of their religion, and one could even get into an argument about whether it is a religion. It's more of an ideology of conquest, as Ayaan Hirsi Ali has said, and they have presented this false image of it as a peace-loving set of doctrines by which you can live your life in harmony with your neighbors, and it's definitely not that. So, again, this is not to, I'm not here to disparage Islam. I'm just saying that one should be able to question it without being accused of being an Islamophobe or a racist or be thrown in jail or prosecuted by a Human Rights Commission somewhere, as in Canada or in European countries, put before some kind of a tribunal and punished for forming an opinion about this force that is a relatively new thing in the American experience, and that our culture and our governmental apparatus hasn't really adapted to yet. And if we don't adapt to it somehow, the left will adapt it for us, and then we're going to have a lot. We're going to have a lot of problems. And it's not going to be the America that most of us here know and love and grew up in. So that's my summary of the contents of Team Jihad.
Terrific. Matt Vadum, thank you very much. Again, the book we're talking about is Matt's new monograph for the Center for Security Policy's Civilization Jihad Reader series. This is, I think, something on the order of the 12th or 13th of the books that we've produced so far in this series. Its subtitle is How Sharia Supremacists Collaborate with Leftists to Destroy the United States. A very important contribution to this body of work, and we're very grateful to Matt for both doing it and coming to talk with us a little bit about it. I'm very pleased to invite Gregory Angelo at this point to add some thoughts about some of the experiences that you've had with this leftist, Islamist axis, and in particular, the anomaly of people on the left who have putatively a very strong attachment to the homosexual, gay rights, civil liberties, human rights agenda, with people who are pretty much hostile to all of the above.
Yeah, I'm happy to, in many ways, pick up where Matthew left off. And I think the remarks that I have for today, I think nicely dovetail with some of the themes that he brings up in his book and some of the things that he talked about today. For those who don't know, Log Cabin Republicans represents LGBT conservatives and straight conservative allies of the LGBT community. We were founded in 1977, so we're actually celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. And much of the work that Log Cabin Republicans has done since our founding in 1977, even through to today, was couched in terms of fighting for things like LGBT non-discrimination legislation, fighting for civil marriage equality for committed same-sex couples. And so many of the debates that I had, and I do say debates, not fights, but certainly many on the left would couch it as fights, were with people of faith. Right? Mostly Christians, Orthodox practitioners of the Jewish faith. And for so much of the history of Log Cabin Republicans, we were told that it was our obligation, not just as LGBT Republicans, but as Americans, to stand up to religion-based bigotry in this country. I would remark that nowhere, in my experience, were there ever Christians that were threatening LGBT individuals with death. Flash ahead to today, where we just days ago commemorated the one-year anniversary of the greatest attack in years in the United States, the greatest terror attack in history, at the gay nightclub Pulse, where 49 individuals who were part of the LGBT community, friends of the LGBT community, were killed. And they were killed by a radical Islamist. It bears mentioning, and it completely dovetails with Matthew's book and the themes that he was talking about today, that Log Cabin Republicans was the only organization representing the LGBT community that called that attack what it was, an act of radical Islamists. And one wonders, or at least one must ask the question, why? Why was Log Cabin Republicans the only organization supposedly representing the LGBT community that stood up and actually spoke out against these atrocities? You didn't see it from any of the organizations representing the LGBT left or coming from a center-left ideology. You didn't see it from supposedly nonpartisan organizations representing the LGBT community. But in no uncertain terms, this is someone who said that he was acting on behalf of Islamic State. This is someone who pledged his allegiance to ISIS as the attack was ongoing. And you wonder, is it a willful ignorance, or is it a willful complicity that you're seeing among center-left LGBT advocates and advocacy organizations when it comes to calling out radical Islam for what it is? And that is an existential threat on the LGBT community, not only abroad, where you have ISIS throwing people off of roofs, where in Iran you are not just imprisoned, but executed for being gay, or just suspected of being gay. And if I may digress a moment, I mean, in Iran, you are hung from a crane if you are found guilty of homosexuality. And why is that? That's because the cranes are the highest place on the skyline in Iran, and so it's to make an example, right, and to admonish others who might even be questioning their own identity, that is their fate if they live their authentic lives. I think that the LGBT community has an obligation, if we are being consistent, to stand out against all forms of religion-based bigotry, especially those who seek to eradicate LGBT individuals from the face of the earth. We have right now, in fact this afternoon, the House of Representatives will be taking up a resolution condemning reports that are coming out of Chechnya, where gay men are being rounded up, thrown into literal concentration camps, tortured, and in some cases executed. And those who are not executed by the state, keep in mind this is the state in Chechnya, right? Those who are not executed by the state are returned to their families with a charge from the police. You know what to do with them, right? And this is because in Chechnya, you have a province that is essentially implementing literal Sharia law. And Sharia law does not only say that homosexuality is wrong, it literally prescribes the death penalty for individuals who are gay, or again, just suspected of being gay. This is something that, to me, should be very easy for members of the LGBT community to stand up, stand against, and call by name. Right? The only way to actually deal with a threat like this and to rise to the challenge is to identify it, first of all, and call it what it is. And you're not seeing that. In fact, in the hours after the attack on the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, you actually had a staff attorney from the ACLU take to Twitter to say that this was not about Islam. The attack at Pulse was because the GOP had filed 200 anti-LGBT bills in 2016. I mean, so Matthew, when you're talking about, I mean, the dissonance.
They blamed guns too.
Guns is yes, that's right. But I mean, when we're talking about the extreme dissonance, right, where somehow the attack at Pulse was caused by evangelical Christians, you are seeing in no uncertain terms an ideology and a liberal tack that sees everything but the actual threat that's in front of it. And not only that, but seeks to blame everything except for what is truly responsible, and that is radical Islam. I mean, I would just add that there are people of all faiths that I know and that I represent as the president of Log Cabin Republicans. There are gay Muslim Republicans that I know. They are not violent people. They do not wish harm on anyone, let alone other gay individuals. But there certainly are those out there who do take a literal interpretation of the Quran, who do see an incompatibility with homosexuality and the teachings of Muhammad, and who see the only remedy for that execution of gay people. And that's something that should send a chill down the spine of anyone, whether you are part of the LGBT community or not. So, Matthew, I thank you for calling attention to some of these issues in your book, and then a host of others, and I'm pleased to be here with you today.
Terrific. Gregory, thank you very much. Again, Matt, we can perhaps engage in a little bit of back and forth and then open the conversation up to others here and perhaps on the internet. I did want to pick up on the point you were properly concerned about this organization, the Southern Poverty Law Center. It has, as you've mentioned, attacked the Center for Security Policy, among many others. It seems to me, without exception, as a result of a difference over the political agendas that they embrace. I did want to ask, in your analysis of this organization, among the groups that you would think would prominently feature in a list, an accurate, honest list of hate groups, would be organizations that propound the kind of ideology that we've just been discussing, whether it's hating homosexuals and murdering them, whether it's the horrible misogyny meted out to women, the treatment of Jews or other minorities, religious and otherwise.
Well, I would even put the Southern Poverty Law Center on a list of hate groups. You know, it inspired, you know, people who commit terrorist acts or try to kill other people are guilty themselves. However, it helped to set the stage for that man to walk into the Family Research Council, which among social conservative groups is not an extreme group, and he went in there because the Southern Poverty Law Center labeled it a hate group, that they accused them of hating gays, and so he wanted to go in there and kill people and then wipe Chick-fil-A sandwiches in their faces, because Chick-fil-A has become a symbol to the left of intolerance towards gays in America, just because one of its executives is a devout Christian and said he didn't believe in same-sex marriage. So it's this sort of craziness. I would put Southern Poverty Law Center at the top of any list of hate groups.
But in addition, they are, it seems, giving a pass to the CARES and
well, they're enabling them, yes.
Various groups that are propounding, really, this
yes, they are.
American, anti-constitutional, anti-freedom agenda. It's anomalous and very troubling, to say the least.
I would agree with you completely, Frank.
In your experience, Gregory, the rise in influence of individuals in the Democratic Party at the moment, Matt mentioned Keith Ellison, the deputy chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Tom Perez, for that matter, who's the chairman, not himself a Muslim or Muslim Brotherhood operative for that matter, but he is clearly one who is an enabler, it would seem to me. Where are they, the Democratic Party leadership, on these sorts of issues? You've described how many of the activists are nowhere to be seen. Is that true of the Democratic Party leadership as well on the left?
I mean, most of my interactions, just to be candid, are with Republicans on Capitol Hill. But you know, don't necessarily want to keep going back to this, but it bears mentioning because we still, as a community, regardless of party affiliation, are bearing the scars, in some cases quite literally, of the attack on the Pulse nightclub. But in the immediate aftermath of that attack, it was not Democrats taking to the airwaves and saying, this is an act of radical Islamic terror. The real leadership that was shown there was from Senator Rubio, who represents Orlando and the entire state of Florida. It was from Republicans around the country that saw this as, that saw clearer than anyone else why the people who were attacked were. And we even saw, in no greater instance, leadership on this issue from then candidate and now President Donald Trump, who at a time when Democrats especially were tiptoeing around why the Pulse nightclub was targeted, you had the president give what is, in my estimation, a historic speech on the Monday after Pulse in New Hampshire, where he talked about the threat of radical Islam, specifically to, as he said, the LGBTQ community. And people talk about that in that historic speech, Donald Trump saying that he, as president, would protect the LGBTQ community, and that would be one of his highest priorities. But people forget the second part often of that quote. And that was, he would protect the LGBTQ community from a radical ideology that seeks to do LGBTQ people harm. So, to me, number one, I think it was an important movement of the needle, because you saw in many cases for the first time in their political careers, Republicans seeing that this was a moment to stand in solidarity with the LGBT community, regardless of how they might feel about the marriage question or bakers or photographers or whatever the case might be. This was far bigger than any of that. And counter that with people on the left that not only did not call the attack at Pulse what it was, but time and again said, this has nothing to do with Islam. Absolutely staggering.
I wanted to go back to something you also mentioned, Matt, and that is the ideology of conquest. You quoted a woman who has been, by the way, vilified by the Southern Poverty Law Center, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. The conquest that I think is particularly relevant to this conversation was the takeover in 1979 of the nation of Iran. And as I know both of you are very much aware, the forces that arrayed against the Shah were on the part the Khomeinists, the Islamists, if you will, the Sharia supremacists, and communists, and secular Democrats. And they joined forces, I think, in the kind of spirit of, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Matt, how did that work out in the end? I mean, obviously the Shah was overthrown, but remind us of how the left and the Democrats fared in the aftermath of the revolution.
I think a lot of them after the Iranian Revolution were slaughtered and thrown into prison, because they're the first people who get their they're the first people who go up on the cranes or just disappear in the middle of the night when there is a takeover by, as you call, by Sharia supremacists, by Islamists, for lack of a better term. So the left, they're the first to get their throats slit, and they seem largely blissfully ignorant, or even willfully ignorant, of the harm that that Sharia law would do to them. There are some on the left who actually recognize this as a problem. There is a writer named Meredith Tax, T-A-X, who wrote a short book. She's still blaming the conservatives and the right wing and whatever for all sorts of things, but she at least acknowledged in it that maybe the left shouldn't be attaching itself to these medieval totalitarian butchers who will kill them once they assume power, because they it's not just it's nothing personal. It's not that they don't. It's not that they don't like them as people necessarily. They want to exterminate them. They want to get rid of gays and other people, the LGBT community. They're not tolerant, and they want these people to be strung up and eliminated. Didn't Ahmadinejad once say there are no homosexuals in Iran? Well,
Yes, he did.
He, in a way, I guess, in his mind, he was telling the truth, because as soon as they're discovered, they're killed. So, if he's keeping a running tab, from a certain perspective, I guess he was right. These people are assisting people who will take them out eventually, but it's very hard for them to look past the short-term political gain of aligning themselves with an alien force that seeks to undermine the United States and Western civilization as a whole.
As long as that's moving in the general direction they
Right,
see.
right.
You both have talked about this idea of sort of willful blindness or willful ignorance, maybe. I wonder if you just explore with me the question of whether this is in fact willful or whether it is compulsory, whether it has become now so much of a dominant strain in our society. I think it was you, Matt, who talked about George W. Bush early on in the post 9/11 period, starting to espouse some of these narratives that I think are very clearly associated with the Muslim Brotherhood and its agitprop, I guess you might call it, from the old days. To what extent does the necessity of complying with political correctness or diversity sensitivity or multiculturalism or what have you, I think whatever we decide to call it for the Islamists, it is actually their view that it is submission, which is a very dangerous thing to be engaging in, needless to say. But could you just talk a little bit about the extent to which we've gotten to a point in our society, whether it's on campuses or whether it's in public discourse, where it is beyond the pale even to talk about these things, hence willful or even compulsory.
I'm happy to talk about the compulsory side, and frighteningly enough, I can see no better example of that than the nothing to see here culture that you're seeing pervading all of Europe. I mean, I have lost count, stopped counting the number of times where Islamists have attacked people in the public square, whether it's at Notre Dame Cathedral, whether it is at an Ariana Grande concert. I mean, the list goes on. And every time, sadly, our response, and I don't mean to be especially glib here, but it's the truth. We light up a building in the colors of the country that was attacked, and then we just go about our business the next day. That's no way to deal with a threat like that. And these, I mean, you're talking about submission here. There it is, right in front of you. I mean, we are not only not calling these attacks for what they are, we are not discussing in the public square what is driving these attacks, but we are also not fighting back against it because we can't. People are afraid to talk about this. Politicians are afraid to talk to their constituents, let alone go onto television, to say that there is a problem with radical jihadists in the Western world. And when you are cowed in such a fashion so that even those who would speak out against it feel that they cannot because they would automatically be marginalized, it's not only chilling, but it is literally dangerous. We are talking life and death hanging in the balance as a result of this.
Yeah. Matt, I assume you may have seen it. I think many others have in the past 24, 48 hours. Robert Spencer published on his website a very, very alarming analysis of what is happening in one of those Western European countries, Sweden, at the moment, in which it's described as either at the edge of or actually in a civil war with the primarily, I guess, transplanted populations from the Middle East now taking over something like 61 so-called no-go zones in the country, and police officers, you know, under assault if they dare to go in there, and many of them now resigning rather than put up with the dangers associated with it. And increasingly, parts of the country are simply being lost to this kind of
Right.
enemy within. To what extent is that? I mean, a classic example of a leftist country, an exemplar of not just a problem in its own right, as you say, but really a warning to the rest of us as to what is in store for us if we don't stop it here.
They're really drinking the Kool-Aid in Sweden, or I guess in this case it'd be the glögg. But Sweden, I haven't read Robert Spencer's new article, but I'm generally familiar with what's going on in Sweden. The crime rate has skyrocketed. The incidence of rape is way up. And I don't think it's a coincidence. It has something to do with the arrival of Muslim refugees and migrants to Sweden. There is official or semi-official policy in Sweden of not even acknowledging that these things are happening, and not saying that it's when a Muslim commits a crime, they don't report it as such. And there's a milder version of that at work here in America too. You often, you know, people say, oh, you've got to pause whenever there's something that seems like an obvious terrorist attack, like the nightclub in Orlando. People say, don't jump to conclusions. But, you know, what else could it be when somebody goes into a gay nightclub and starts shooting people at random? You know, I'm guessing it wasn't Methodists or Amishmen.
But even in Orlando,
Yeah.
the shooter actually told police, "I am
Right.
an agent of Islamic State,
Yeah.
Allahu Akbar."
Right. He
But-
might as well have brought his own publicist with him to make it clear that this was, you know, like with his Islamic State flag with him, to make it clear. That's right. And they
Even then, I imagine even
yeah.
then, if he did that, you know, there would be hand-wringing on the left and deep
There-
introspection, wondering if only we had curtailed the Second Amendment more.
Right. And then there are other examples of people being ridiculed. I think it was Steve Emerson at Investigative Project on Terrorism, who was ridiculed for saying on TV that there are no-go zones. I don't know if he said a particular country in Europe, but he said there are no-go zones in Britain, which there are, obviously, in the United Kingdom, especially in London, or as some people call it, Londonistan, which now has a Muslim mayor who I understood banned billboards that depict women in bikinis, and that's, you know, and this is Britain's a country where they'll have like topless women on like page 5 of the local tabloid,
Or 1.
or page 1, you know, where they don't block things out necessarily. Like this is quite quite unusual for a place like jolly old England. So there definitely are no-go zones. There was the what was it, Rotherham, the so-called grooming scandal in England, and like nobody wanted to talk about it. And the police discouraged reporting on it, and the officials said, "Oh, you know, this has nothing to do with the profound lack of respect that many Muslims have for women, and this sexual enslavement scandal, rape scandal, the repercussions of it are still being felt."
Which had gone on for years.
Right.
Known to and unchallenged by the authorities.
That's right. So these things, it's not just that they're happening, it's that there is strong pressure from the government or social pressure among, other members of the media in those countries not to report on things, not to call them by their proper name. Look at Canada. Canadian permanent resident, what was his name, Batumi, came over a few days ago from, I believe it was Ontario, and then went to Flint, Michigan, and shot a police officer.
Stabbed him.
Stabbed him. Stabbed him
in the throat.
In the throat. And shouted, God is the greatest, Allah Akbar, as he or before he did it. This is what that's the cry of the jihadist, you know, that helps him get into the into heaven with the honeyed virgins and all that other hubbub. You know, people are in denial about it in the U.S., in Canada, in Europe, and I'm just glad we at least have a president now, President Donald Trump, who is, you know, he still needs some educating on the topic, but I think he's moving in the right direction, and he recognizes that there is a hateful foreign ideology that wants to limit our freedoms at a minimum, and you know, kill off a lot of us at worst, and that we have to do something about this. And it was really music to my ears when I heard yesterday that the Supreme Court largely lifted the injunctions against President Trump's travel ban from terrorism-producing regions. And of course, the left and the media keeps lying about it over and over again, saying it's a Muslim ban. No, there are plenty of other countries that are majority Muslim that he could have banned. These are countries that have problems with terrorism. And it's not even a permanent thing. Remember, it was a temporary thing. A lot of people have forgotten. It was a pause so that America could reevaluate its policy with a new president coming in, and then set a course for, and then establish so-called extreme vetting procedures to make sure that these terrorists, who we know are insinuating themselves into migrant and refugee communities, we know they're coming over. They've said so. We have to be able to defend the country against that. And it was a breath of fresh air to hear that the Supreme Court slapped around the wacky Ninth Circuit and the other judges, federal judges, who had been interfering with the president's ability to conduct national security policy, which is, at least when I took constitutional law in undergrad days, the president's power in this area is supposed to be almost totally unfettered, because he's elected by the people. It's not these guys. It's not these unelected bureaucrats in black robes who are, you know, should be sitting there second guessing his judgments. They're not entitled to do that. At least that's what I learned from my left-wing Democrat law professor in undergrad days.
That's back in the days when they used to teach that sort of thing. Still,
back in the days,
not so much done anymore.
Back in the days before multiculti and group and identity politics took over the left, and there were people on the left who were still reasonable on many things.
I just want to pick up on that last point, Matt. One of the things that President Trump said as a candidate, of course, was his belief that part of that vetting ought to be to ensure that people who do not share our values are not admitted to this country. And he specifically used the term Sharia in that context. A very important speech on the subject on August 15th of last year in Youngstown, Ohio. I commend to everyone. I'd also commend, again, that article at jihadwatch.com, Robert Spencer's excellent resource, in part because one of the things that was particularly chilling about this essay about what's happening in Sweden was he recounted a statement, really, I guess the French would call it a cri de coeur, an appeal on the part of the chief of the national police, saying, help us, because the police are now so, I think, unable to contend with what is unraveling around them in Sweden. So these are the times we're in. Again, our book is Team Jihad, How Sharia Supremacists Collaborate with Leftists to Destroy the United States. Matt Vadum is its author. The Center for Security Policy is the publisher, and I want to open the floor at this point if anyone in the room has questions or comments, please.
Yeah, I do. Matt, you discussed President Trump's moves, which I think are excellent. I mean, I think he's doing yeoman's work trying to get past the Democrat obstruction and take steps that are really going to be beneficial to our nation's security in this area. But I see some low-hanging fruit. Like, one of the things I'm working on at Judicial Watch is trying to get records out of the State Department relating to U.S. aid, State Department money, U.S. taxpayer money, going to George Soros-backed organizations in Macedonia, and I also sent requests for records about money going to Albania. George Soros-backed organizations in which he's trying to align the left with the Islamists in, for example, Macedonia, in which approximately 25–30% of the population are Albanians who are refugees in Macedonia. So he's creating, and Soros very effectively, I would say, through these media organizations and everything, these NGOs that he has, 60 of them in Macedonia, that he's funded over there. They've created this, as you say, this very, very well, this unholy alliance there. Why hasn't Trump replaced the entire mission in Macedonia, U.S. mission there, where I've had senior Macedonian officials tell me this guy, the U.S. ambassador there is further left than Obama, and he is, they are so vested in the left, in helping the leftists there, and yet we see millions of dollars in U.S. aid going to Soros-backed organizations, of all things. They're trying to do just this thing that you discussed. I don't understand why that ambassador has not been replaced, why the whole mission hasn't been cleaned out. And this is just, it seems to me it should be low-hanging fruit.
It's like, why is John Koskinen, who did the cleanup work for the Obama administration at the IRS, trying to cover up the IRS targeting scandal, Lois Lerner targeting conservative and libertarian and Tea Party groups for different treatment by the IRS in granting tax-exempt organization status. Why hasn't he replaced John Koskinen? He's just, I can't speak for the White House, but they're a very slow-moving bunch, and it's my understanding that they're just taking too much time. It's not entirely their fault. There are vetting procedures that have to be gone through, but I don't think that there are even enough people in the White House. It's my understanding there aren't enough people in the office that makes these staffing decisions to process applicants. And it probably doesn't help that, and I'm not saying this is a good policy or not, President Trump's the 5-year ban on lobbying after serving in the administration. That probably has scared off a lot of people who aren't independently wealthy, from wanting to serve in the administration. So again, I'm not saying it's a bad policy. It sounds like a good policy, at least on its face, but there are a lot of problems in getting people, and you're seeing a lot of eventually what's likely going to happen is a lot of the old Republican Guard are going to start showing up and filling these positions, or some people call them rhinos, Republicans in name only, are filling various positions, and Trump is taking too long.
That's the best case.
Yeah, that's the best case scenario.
Worse, they just keep these guys in.
Right. I imagine part of the problem too is that the press has so vilified this administration and anyone associated with Trump that that in itself must scare off a lot of potentially good people, and that I'm not sure I want this on my resume that I worked for the Trump administration. I mean, there must be, I'm sure.
Yeah, they're trying to demonize and build it so that having worked for Trump is a stain on your resume, like he's, it's like having worked for Hitler or Augusto Pinochet, though they're not. I like Augusto Pinochet, but I think he's given a rough ride by history, and it's unfair. But
again, this is
a topic for another day. But this is a technique. That's right. Is they are
not an expert.
They are trying to delegitimize everything that Trump does. They're trying to treat everything that he does as if it's not normal. Like, for example, a couple of months ago, he fired all the United States attorneys. It is his absolute unquestionable right or power, within his authority under the Constitution to do that. They're his lawyers, his employees. and yet it was treated like it was a big scandal. Bill Clinton did the same thing. Trump, right, on day one, Trump waited a few months to do it, which I can understand because it was a very unusual transition. And, he had Obama undermining him the whole time and laying, intelligence community booby traps for him all over the place, that many of which we're just learning about now. So, there's been a lot of problems in staffing up key positions in the administration, and the left is not going to stop, and the people in the so-called deep state, like this fellow Evan McMullen, or I like to call him McMuffin, who Egg McMuffin. He ran his independent candidacy for president. He was hoping to take Utah and then throw the election to the Electoral College. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. But he's just he's just there poking the whole time. People like him poking, putting their finger in the eye of the administration, and accusing them of all sorts of crazy, throwing all sorts of crazy conspiracy theories at them. The most prominent one is the Russians hacked the election conspiracy theory, which there's never been any evidence of collusion between President Trump as president or before he was president with a hostile foreign power, with an unfriendly foreign power trying to influence our elections. It's a crazy conspiracy theory, and yet we've got a lot of Republicans going along with that. Is it because on Capitol Hill? Is it because they believe that something serious happened, or is it because they hate President Trump? I suspect it's a bit of both. So he is definitely not being given a fair shake, but he came here to what's that phrase? To drain the swamp. So the swamp is not eager to be drained.
Either here or in Macedonia, for that matter.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Question or comment from the audience? Yes.
So, thank you all for being here, for informing us on this critical and counterintuitive problem that the country faces. I was wondering if you could comment on the few truth tellers on the left, like Sam Harris or Bill Maher, who are stating the obvious and saying that, in the example of Sam Harris, saying that if there is a religion of peace, it would be Jainism. And the more radical a Jainist becomes, the less you have to worry about him, when the contrary is true of Islam. And Omar just got in trouble again for saying things that are obviously and evidently true. What is the potential, based on this, for a rift opening up between those who actually do care about the things that they profess to care about on the left, including LGBT rights, and those who care most about bringing down the system?
Could everyone hear that question, including our audience? Great.
I'll
take the first
jump
cut
in. Yeah, it can be difficult to read the tea leaves in this regard, but if I had to guess, there would not be a schism in the left. It would be a shrinking of the left. If you look at people like Bill Maher, or I believe his name is it John Rubin, the guy who does the Rubin Report? Dave Rubin, yeah, right, excuse me, Dave Rubin. Dave Rubin actually had a very public video that he put out saying, I still identify as a liberal, but the Democratic Party does not represent me, and among other things, it was the hypocrisy, the dissonance that the Democratic Party and liberals in general, who are politically affiliated with the Democratic Party, are exhibiting when it comes to Islam, when it comes to jihadists. So I don't necessarily see a warring there, but I do see, I guess just a left that is increasingly monolithic in the way it thinks, the groupthink, and the requirement that one must adhere and subscribe to 100% of their ideology, otherwise you will be unwelcome. And not only will you not be welcomed, you will be told to leave the party, right? And I am seeing that. This is all anecdotal, but I'm seeing that around people like Bill Maher and others, where Democrats are quick to distance themselves from him when, at least in cases of his discussions of radical Islam, he is telling the truth.
I don't think there's any possibility of a rift in the foreseeable future. So my answer to your question, Dr. Hull, is no.
Well, I would just add that I think the point is, as you say, that the alternative to a rift is the marginalization and excommunication, maybe, of people who dare to deviate from the party line. It's an ominous trend, and it makes all the more important, I think, the kind of clarity, Matt, that you've been bringing to this, and Gregory, thank you for your contributions as well. I was just about to wrap up, but we have now 2 more questions. I'll be happy to take them. Jessie Jane?
Gregory, I have a question for you. And this is just from a perspective of, if everybody wants America safe, why isn't the LGBT community demanding it of the Democratic leaders instead of circling the wagons with them? I'm just very curious, because they do tend to lean Democrat. We do have plenty that have been voting for Trump, and there's many that are out there actively. But why haven't they had, a forum against this difficulty they're facing, this wall?
Yeah, again, I would reiterate, and it bears mentioning, Log Cabin Republicans is the only organization representing the LGBT community that has been outspoken or said anything about this. And what we've seen, especially in a post-Obergefell country where marriage equality is recognized in all 50 states, is organizations that purport to represent the LGBT community, that purport to be nonpartisan, are now really just the gay wing of the Democratic Party, or the LGBT wing of the Democratic Party. And once you see that for what it is, you understand that their mission is now no longer to advocate for the LGBT community, but to espouse Democratic talking points and to elect Democrats that also subscribe to those talking points. We stand out as an organization at Log Cabin Republicans, as an organization that I would argue has not only been the most consistent in the way we have couched religion in terms of the fight that we have as the LGBT community to obtain equal rights in the United States and to fight discrimination, but we are also the most representative of the LGBT community because of that consistency. I'm with you. I would love to grab some people on the LGBT left, especially people who purport themselves to be advocates for the community, who purport to speak for people like me, and grab them by the lapels and say, come on, wait, snap out of it, right? What does that chair say in Moon? But I'm not seeing that, because there is, again, a idea on the left that if you were to speak out, you would, in some cases, you wouldn't just be excommunicated from the Democratic Party, you would be excommunicated from the LGBT community. Right? I mean, we've seen that just over the course of the last year. Peter Thiel, The Advocate, a magazine that once called him a gay power player, published an op-ed saying Peter Thiel is not gay, or he cannot use the word gay to describe who he is, because he does not embody what it means to be gay. Gay, and this is part of that op-ed, I'd encourage people to look it up. Gay is a political identity. It is not a sexual orientation, right? And so I guess I would just encourage folks and those people who are watching here that if you want an organization that is consistent on these matters, that is not afraid to speak out against jihadists, your home is in Log Cabin Republicans.
I would paraphrase what Milo Yiannopoulos, a gay conservative bomb thrower, if you will, who was at Breitbart.com, and he said something to the effect of, "Why should I be happy at the prospect of importing people to my country who want to take me and people like me and throw us off roofs?" And that basically, this is common sense. This is common sense, but common sense seems to be in short supply on the left.
Yeah, sir.
Yes, Matthew, have you seen any evidence of a political price being paid by the American left for carrying water for Islamism? I mean, I think there must be one eventually. The pattern of attacks since Charlie Hebdo has been so evident to normal people. So I'm wondering, in your research, have you run across any either polling data or anecdotal stories that normal people are beginning to associate Democrats with these attacks?
Well, thanks for that question. I would say the most obvious example is the election of Donald Trump. People are fed up with political correctness, and they're not necessarily on board with everything that this group here might say about the threat from Sharia supremacists and from Islam. But they generally see it as a problem, and they want someone in power who is open to doing something about it. And I think the same argument can be made for the voters keeping Republican majorities in both houses of Congress, even though they totally don't deserve it. They're better than the Democrats. We have to keep telling ourselves over and over again, and it gets exhausting after a while. But I think though that's an example. The four special elections that the Democrats thought they would at least be able to wrest one or two of those seats away from Republicans so far this year. And that's big wave that they keep talking about, just like the communists are always saying, the revolution is coming, it's just around the corner. Well, it never came, even in the 6th District of Georgia, where John Ossoff went down in flames to Karen Handel, who's actually a conservative heroine of mine. She's she's a strong leader, and it was nice to see her get elected. But these are all little bits of anecdotal evidence suggesting that the public is fed up and they want something done about this issue. As for data points and studies, that's I'm not really aware of that. I think that the results at the ballot box are the strongest evidence in support of the point that I'm trying to make.
I would just add that I think, again, it's anecdotal rather than, statistically demonstrable, but I do think that many in this country have an unease about what's happening here, but they're now increasingly alive to what's happening in Europe and are making a connection between the trajectory that these Sharia supremacists have put that continent on and what they have in mind for us. So it's a telltale, perhaps, as they say, of a growing sentiment in this country that may not have been demonstrated beyond what Matt says, and I think he's absolutely right, but one that I think is a building. I pray it is, at least. And if so, it will be, I'm sure, informed by this terrific book, Matt. Team Jihad, How Sharia Supremacists Collaborate with Leftists to Destroy the United States. Thank you so much for making the effort to pull this together, Matt, for sharing it with us, and Gregory, of course, for your efforts to help broaden our understanding of how really perilous this whole agenda is of the leftists and the Islamists for all of us. We appreciate your tuning in and look forward to bringing us together again in the near future with another product of the Center for Security Policy in collaboration with our friends. Thank you very much for joining us today.